Hey everyone, this is going to be a project walkthrough for NASA Photo. So I've already cloned and forked my repo here. The first step that I've taken in my terminal is to run a yarn install. And that's going to download all of my dependencies. And now I want to see it in the browser, so I'm going to run yarn start. It's going to take a second to spin up, and I'm first going to run headlong into an error that I'm sure a lot of you saw, and I want to talk about what we should do when we see it. So I'm just going to open that tab, localhost 3000, inside of Firefox, and get started. So, in my project, we want to go into the source directory, that's where all of our good stuff lives, and find app.js, because that's where everything starts. This is like our body tag. This is what actually shows up on the page. So our first step, we might think, is to try to go and get data from the API. And to do that, we're going to need Axios. The way we used Axios on our vanilla JavaScript projects was to add a CDN to our script tags. That's not what we do here. In React, we get to use some nice package management features. So we can import import Axios just like we're importing React here. So I'm going to try that. I'm going to import Axios from Axios. When we don't specify a path, React is going to assume that we want to import this from a library. So I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to get an error. And this is one of those errors that is helpful once you understand what it's saying. So it says module not found. Cannot resolve Axios in, and it's giving me this path that ends in my source directory. So that's where I currently am. What this means is that because I didn't specify a relative path, Yarn is going to go ahead and check. Let me mute my notifications. Yarn is going to go ahead and check and see if we have a package called Axios installed. We don't. So it then goes and tries to look in our current directory to see if I have a file called axios.js, and I don't. So that's why we're getting this error. So when we see this, that means that the package that we're trying to use, Axios, is not actually installed. If we want to check what packages are installed in our project, we can always go out of our source directory into just the root of our project, and we can find this package.json file. And that has a bunch of stuff in it, but it has right here this list of dependencies. And so our current dependencies are React, React DOM, and React scripts. Axios isn't in here. How do we add this? Well, we flip over to our terminal, we kill the server that we have, we kill the yarn start with Control C, and then I can do yarn add Axios. And it's going to go ahead and download and add that to my node modules folder for me. It's going to take a minute. But once that's done, I can rerun yarn start. I can close the Chrome window it wants to open, and I can refresh my page. And once that connects, we have our project, and it's not getting mad at me about the Axios import anymore. But I don't actually want to start with getting data from my server. One of the things we want to think about with components is how we separate responsibilities. We kind of want components to do one thing. We want them to have a singular, well-defined purpose. So we can have a component that goes and fetches the data from the server, and another component that takes that data and then renders it into what we want to appear on the page. And those are really separate responsibilities. The component that takes the data and makes it presentational for us doesn't really care where the data is coming from. So what I want to do is I want to write that component first and then just give it some hard-coded data and check and see if it works. Then I'm going to go to my API, get that data, and pass it to my component, and it's going to be none the wiser about where that data is coming from. And that's the beauty of writing these components that we pass data to via props, is that we're not concerned, you know, with stuff happening outside of the scope of those components. We can separate those responsibilities, and we can easily, later if we have time, reuse our component to display the image over and over and over again. And it doesn't really care, because we've separated the concerns of getting the data from presenting the data. And that's a big gain in terms of writing these reusable, resilient applications. So let's do this. I'm going to leave app up on the bottom, but we have lots of ways to organize our components. I believe the official line on how to organize this from Dan Abramoff, one of the members of the React team, is move files around until it feels good. Commonly, we're going to see a components folder. And so that's what I'm going to use now. I could put it just inside of this directory, but I don't want to. In this case, this is going to be the only component that I have, but it's good practice to start thinking about how we want to organize these things. Inside of components, I'm going to be a little bit lazy, and I'm just going to make my JS file here. I'm not going to make a subdirectory for it, and that's fine. I'm going to call this, let's call it photocard.js. And I'm using capital letters here at the start, because when we write React components, we always start them with a capital letter. And that's largely out of convention, because we used to have to write React components as classes. And in JavaScript, we always write classes beginning with a capital letter. So it's not enforced anywhere, but we want to stick to convention where possible, so it's easier when other people read our code. Now, first step, as always, is to import React from React so we can make use of our JSX. I'm going to define my component, photocard. It's going to take in an argument props. I just always add this argument here, even if I don't end up using it, because all of our components always accept props, whether we use it or not. And then I'm going to export this component, photocard. Alright, first things first, I'm just going to have this return some dummy JSX, and then hook this up into app, because I want to start getting feedback right away. I want to know right away if I'm making any mistakes. And the way we do that is we force React to render our component. How do we render our component? By including it inside of app. Or, you know, including it inside of a component that's included inside of app. But we have to make React try to put it on our page so it runs our code and we find any errors that we have. So now I need to import this component. I'm going to import photocard from, now I'm going to specify the relative path. This starts from where I currently am. I'm inside the source directory, so when I do /, that's what it means. Inside the source directory is a directory called components, and inside of there is my photocard. So now I'm going to render this, and we render a component by just including it in our JSX. Photocard. And let's see if this works. There we go. Now it's hooked up. So as I make changes to photocard, they're going to show up inside of our browser. And so we're going to get feedback on what we're doing and any mistakes that we're making. So I'm going to take a look now at the kind of data that I'm getting back from my API. And I just visited it directly in my browser, and Firefox and Chrome both have these nice little windows that will display the JSON we're getting back from our server nicely. So we see some different information. For now, I'm just going to start with, I'm going to assume I'm going to want this title. I'm going to want the image, and let's get this explanation in there too. These are 3 things I can start with, and it's going to be very easy to add more stuff to this photocard if we want to. So I'm going to have a div. I'm going to add a title. I'll make that an h2. I'm going to add an image tag, and right now I don't really have a URL for that. We can hard code one in. let's do that. I'll get this one. Grab that image tag, drop it in here. And then what else did I want? The explanation. I'll just put this in here. Alright. Great. So that's loaded up. Oh, looks like I caught a truncated URL here. But that's fine. It doesn't really matter. I'm just checking to see if this is working. So our next step is to think about how we want to get data into this component. Because I don't want PhotoCard to always display this. That would not be a very useful component. So I have to give it data that I want it to display. How do we pass data in React? Via props. We pass data via props. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some props to PhotoCard. We can think of props like arguments. Partially because they kind of end up like arguments, but also where we apply them. So this is where I'm rendering PhotoCard. Kevin, here is a link to the API. I'm not going to give you my API key just in case I get timed out while doing this this project. And I am trying to be better about watching Slack, so if you have questions, please post them in the Web21 After Party channel. So I'm going to pass some props to PhotoCard. So I'm going to give it a title, and just like we give arguments to a function when we call it, we give props to a component when we render it. So I'm using my PhotoCard here, so this is where I'm going to give it the data. So I'm going to give it a title, and I'm just going to give it more sample data. Props title. I'm going to give it a URL for the image, and you know, this is not a URL. And then I'm going to give it an explanation as well. Okay. So now those don't show up on my page. That's because I haven't made use of them yet. It's probably a good idea, while we're still getting comfortable with the idea of props, to console log this props object at the top of every single one of our components, so we can see what's inside of there, so there's kind of no mystery about, like, wait, what do I do with this thing? So let's console log this, and then check our developer console, which is something we should be checking often. Okay, so now we see that props is an object. It has 3 keys. Actually, let me get my face out of there in the recording. It has 3 keys: explanation, title, and URL. And those are the same as the names we chose for the props when we rendered this component. These names can be anything we want. I was speaking with a student yesterday, and I think I came up with something that can maybe help some of that confusion. See how title is on the left-hand side of the equal sign? That makes it kind of like a variable name. We can name variables whatever we want. Title is kind of like our variable here, so I can call it whatever I want. And then the right-hand side of the equal sign is going to be its value. And this gets translated into the props object as title being the key, and then whatever I had on the right-hand side being the value of that prop. So now I can use these inside of my component. I'm going to replace this hard-coded title with some JavaScript inside of curly braces. So I'm going to do props.title. I'm going to replace this hard-coded URL with props.url. And then I'm going to replace this hard-coded example with props.explanation. Title, URL, and explanation are each keys inside of our props object. So we access them by doing dot and then the name of the key, just like in normal JavaScript. So when I save this file, I should see these values I'm passing in props be rendered to my component. There we go. So now we're passing data into our component. Our component doesn't care where we're getting that data from. So now I could play around with how I want to present this data and do that entirely separately from the process of getting the data from the API, which is what I want to try to do now. Because I have this component working, I have it rendering data, now I want to get data from NASA. So this was the link to the API that I'm going to be using, and this is the data I'm getting back. We're going to make requests to the API the same way we did in vanilla JavaScript using the Axios library. And so that's going to be the same. I'm going to use axios.get, and then I'm going to give it the URL. There we go. And now I want to have a brief discussion about what we're doing here, because we did touch on APIs earlier, but I think it's really important for us to have a solid understanding of how we use these API requests and what we're doing with promises. So when I make this GET request, this is going to take time, potentially a while. If I have a slow internet connection or NASA's servers are backed up. I forgot to add my face back in the recording. I'm sorry for depriving you of that. So this request is going to take time, and potentially a long amount of time. And I don't want my entire application to stop working until I get my data back from the server. And there are many ways of handling these kinds of events. JavaScript has chose promises, which basically lets me run this code in the background and keep doing whatever I was doing. And then when this finishes, we can execute some code. So that's why we do a .then. I'm saying once this request is finished, now I want you to execute this code. So we have to give then a callback, right? That's how we delay the execution of code, is with a function. So we give the Axios request this function and say, hey, when the request is done, please run this function. If I just put regular code in here, that would run immediately, and that's not what I want. I want to delay the execution of my code, so I give it this function. Axios is going to be kind enough to give me back the response object it got from the server. I like calling that res, so that's what I'm going to do. We can call it whatever we want, and then I'm going to define my function body, and I'm going to console log res. And I'm also going to put two more console logs in here, one at the top and one at the bottom. And so we're going to see when our React app runs, we get this console log at the top, but then we get the one at the bottom. Because even though the console log of the response object is in between those, in terms of where it shows up in our code, this doesn't actually run until our request finishes. So that's going to take some time. So the order in which our code executes is different than the order in which it's written in this file. Top's going to execute first, then bottom. Then whenever our request finishes, we're going to log the result. So we see that we have this big response object here. And this has a ton of stuff in it, some of which can be useful, but right now I care about this data key, because this has all the information about my photograph inside of it. So I'm going to do res.data. Alright, so now I'm making this request and I'm getting the data back from my server. So we need to figure out some way of getting this data out of my then block and into my normal component, because I want to access that data. And the way we're going to do that is with useState, because useState gives me a way to define a variable, and then it also gives me a function so I can set the value of that variable. So I need to import useState from React, and then I'm going to make a stateful variable. I'm going to remove these extra console logs for now, and I'm going to make a stateful variable. And let's say the first thing I want to do is I want to get the title, right? That's one of the props I have down here. So let me get the title. So I'm going to get the title, and then I'm going to name the function I use to set the title. We can call this whatever we want, but again, out of tradition, we're going to call it set and then our variable name. I'm going to call useState, and I'm going to give it the initial value of my title. We can leave this blank because we don't have a title for now, but something that might save errors in the future, and I'll cause one of these errors so you can see it, is to keep the initial value of the same data type as what we expect title to eventually be. So we know we're going to get back a string, so I'm going to give it an empty string. That way if I try to do any stuff to title later that expects a string, it'll still work if title isn't set. And I'll show an example of what that's like in a bit. So now I have my title. And what I want to do is I want to get the title out of my data and set it in that variable. So I'm going to do that. I'll leave this console log here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set the title to be res.data.title because that's what's in this object. This object is res. It's got data. And inside that data, there's a key called title. And it's got the title string that I want to use. So I'm going to set my title to be that string. And now that I have access to this inside of this variable, I can give that as a prop to my photo card component because it doesn't care where I'm getting that data from. As long as I give it this title as a prop, it'll put it on the page. We've been able to separate these concerns entirely, and that's one of the powers of writing these components. So now I want to give it title. These variables are coincidentally named the same. We're often going to do that for the sake of consistency, but I could name the thing on the left-hand side whatever I wanted it to be. They just both happen to be named title. And we do this inside of curly braces because title is a variable in our JavaScript. So whenever we want to reference JavaScript, we have to do that inside of curly braces when we're writing JSX. So now, when I save this, we see we get space station crosses a spotless sun. So now we're getting data from our API. But I want more data than just this. So we might think, okay, I also want the URL and the explanation. So what I can do is I can add more stateful variables. I can do another one for the explanation. And I can do set explanation. And I can do another one for the URL, and I can do set URL. But we're seeing us repeat ourselves. And this should be one of these smell tests. This should be one of the things our intuition is starting to develop, that there's probably a better way of doing this. Well, one of the things we want to do as programmers is avoid repeating ourselves. So we want to try to find a way to write this code that's going to be reusable, that we're not going to have to do this for every single piece of data that I want. Well, let's take a look at how I would do it this way, though. So instead of calling set title, right, I'm going to do set explanation. And I'm going to get the explanation key out of my data object and set the explanation like this. So instead of doing this all individually, what if there was a way to have this data all packaged up in one place? Then I'd only have to set one variable. Well, it turns out our API has already given us that nice package of data. And that's the res.data object. Instead of pulling these out individually, I can just set the entire object into one of my variables. And now I don't have to write them individually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of these. And I'm going to change this. I'm going to make this data and set data. And I'm going to change the initial value from a string to an empty object. Because the data I'm expecting to get back from my server is an object. So I want to try to keep that data type consistent, because that's going to save us from bugs. In a minute, I'll remove this, and we're going to see what happens when you forget to keep that data type consistent. So now, instead of setting title to be the title, I just want to save this entire data object. Does anyone have questions about what we've done here? Okay. So now I have access to this entire data object. So what I can do is use that to pass this data into props. So instead of using this title variable that I no longer have defined, I now have this data object. And I know that that object is going to have the title key in it. So instead of doing res.data.title here, I can do it down here, because this whole data object is something I now have access to. So let's see what happens. There we go. It works. And now I don't have to keep making new state variables. I can do this for the URL. I can change this to data.url. I can do it for the explanation too. Data.explanation. There we go. Now we're getting our title, a photo, which is a little bit too big, and my explanation. So now we've been able to get our data from our server. We've been able to write it in a way that's reusable. And we've written a component that takes that data in and makes it presentational for us. It gives us back how we want to display that on our page. Now I want to show you what happens when I don't give this use state an object. By default, if I don't give this an argument, it's going to set data to be undefined. Now we get an error, and it's telling me data is undefined. And that's because the first time I run this application, useState is going to set data to be a default value. In this case, it's undefined. I'm immediately then going to set the value of data from this Axios request, but that's going to take time to run, right? It's not going to happen immediately. So the first time this component renders, we're going to get the data, or we're not going to have the data yet, I'm sorry. And so it's going to be undefined. And so down here, when I try to do data.title, I'm going to get an error because I cannot access keys of undefined. I can access keys of an empty object, but what's going to happen is data.title is going to be undefined, right? Because it's not in our object. So now we have this hooked up and working. So I want to talk about something that I haven't done yet, which is useEffect. Some of you might be confused why this is working. And that's because of how this is structured right now. But I want to talk about why we use useEffect. So we do useEffect when we want to run code sometimes. The way React works is whenever the data inside of our component changes, it's going to re-render the component because React wants to get at this new return value, or JSX with whatever that updated data is. The only way React has to do that is to run our entire function again. There's a problem with the way I have this code written. And that's that the first time React renders this component, it's going to run this function. That's going to run my Axios.get. And so when that's done, it's going to set my data. And when it sets my data, React is going to say, oh, they have new data. I have to re-render this component. And when it does that, it's going to run this whole function again. The problem is that runs my request again. And that's going to go out and request data from the server, and it's going to set it again, and React is going to say, oh, I have new data. Let me re-render this component. And so it's going to run this function again. We're saved right now solely based on the fact that we're setting it to be the exact same data, and React is efficient and it's able to recognize, oh, our data doesn't actually change. I don't have to re-render this component. If we got back slightly different data, or data React wasn't able to identify as being the same, then we would end up making an infinite number of requests. Because as soon as our Axios request finished, then we'd kick another one off when we reran the function and it reran our request. And then we'd keep doing that over and over and over again, and NASA would ban us, and that would be bad. Right now, we're making that request multiple times, which is already bad enough. So we have a tool, and that's called useEffect. And useEffect lets us run code sometimes. And the way that works is useEffect is got a very similar function signature to set timeout. The way set timeout works is we give it a callback function, and then we give it some amount of time. And whenever that time is finished, it's going to run the callback function. useEffect works kind of similarly. useEffect takes a callback function as its first argument. It takes some code that we want to delay the execution on. And then it takes as its second argument an array of data. And whenever any piece of data in this array changes from the last time we ran our component, useEffect is going to run our callback function. So this allows us to run code sometimes. We can run code conditionally. So let's say I had, some variable set that went and got a specific picture from the API. We could have code set up so that whenever that variable changes, useEffect knows that it needs to go out and get a new picture. And so it'll run the callback function with our request in it and go and get that specific picture. And now we have a very powerful way of defining when we want things to happen. Because we don't want certain things to happen on every render of our component, right? This is an expensive operation, getting stuff from NASA servers. And we're potentially doing this an infinite number of times. And that's very bad, and it'll get us banned. Or, as Dan said, we could rack up, a ton of debt quickly, if we're doing this on like an AWS server. And now suddenly our function's been running forever, and we owe Jeff Bezos a lot of money. And I don't have that much money. But what happens when I give it an empty array? Because I talked about how we have data that changes, right? We have data that changes, and useEffect is going to run our function. If I give it an empty array, that data is never going to change because it's nothing. And nothing can't change. I know that sounds like a weird double negative, but I literally mean that nothing, the existence of nothing, cannot change. So what's going to happen is the first time we render this component, useEffect is going to run our callback function. Because that's what it does. The first time we render our function, all of our useEffects are going to run. But the second time we render the function, after our request is finished, and we set this data, because when we set the data, React is going to try to re-render our function. And when it does, useEffect is going to see that nothing in this array has changed. And because nothing in this array has changed, it's not going to run our request again. Now we have a tool to specify how to run code sometimes. And so now I'm only ever making this request once. If I add a console.log in here, we'll see that this appears on the first render. And even though our component re-renders, you can watch it happen for a split second. There's nothing here. And then our component suddenly gets new stuff. That's a re-render. So our useEffect, though, is only happening on the first render. It's only happening the first time we use this function. And that's thanks to useEffect, which lets us run code conditionally. And that's awesome. We could try to do fancy stuff with if statements to check if things have changed and all of that, but useEffect is a nice, reusable, well-packaged tool to let us do conditional execution of code. And I love it, and I want you all to love it too. I want you to have the same positive relationship with useEffect that I do. Does anyone have any questions with this? No? We're all feeling good about use effect? All right. So I had a request from someone.
Actually, Henry, I had a quick question on
Yeah.
use effect. Um, I was reading some articles about use effect that you can try to fool use effect with the variables that the use effect callback depends on, and you can like purposefully leave out the actual variables that are dependent upon by the callback, and that can lead to bugs. Do you have any light insight onto that?
Yes. So with the array that we're giving use effect, we can consider this array an array of dependencies. And we would generally put any variables we're using inside of here inside of this array. Um, so what that's going to mean is that whenever any of the variables that our callback is dependent on change, we're going to run that callback again. If we don't include some variables that our callback depends on inside of this array, well, then we might not trigger it appropriately because one of those variables might change. And if we don't include it in here, then we're not going to rerun our callback. And this can lead to bugs. And sometimes we want behavior so that we only run this function when certain data changes and not all the data we end up using. But we have to be very careful and think through the steps of how the data might change, of how we might do that. So we generally, inside of that array, want to put all of the data that we depend on. And if we end up only wanting it to do it sometimes based on when that data changes, we can use some filtering inside of our callback. But we want to make sure that we declare all of our dependencies inside of here. And React will actually give us a warning when we use a variable inside of here, inside of our callback, that we don't add to this dependency array. Because this is here to make sure that our code is running when it should. And if we're not doing that, it can lead to subtle bugs where things don't happen when they're supposed to. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, yeah. The filtering inside the callback makes sense if
Okay.
you wanted to trigger, not using all of the variables.
Yeah.
Another quick question is like, it's called use effect,
Hmm.
and the word effect is pertaining to side effects, correct?
Yes. So what we can think of as side effects is whatever our function does that it doesn't return. So in math, we think of functions as relations. So like if you graph a function, you have x, which is your dependent variable, which is a fancy way of saying input, and that results as a point on y. So you end up having these curves because we give it an input and it gives us an output. And in math, that's the only thing our function can do. So in code, when we call these functions, that's not always true. Because sometimes when we give them the same input, they give us different output. And in math, that would no longer be considered a function. And whenever that happens, that's due to a side effect. That means our function depends on something that wasn't explicitly stated as an argument to that function. Our input was the same, but we got different output, so that means our function depends on more than the inputs. That's what we mean by side effects, because there must be some side channel that it's getting data in or data out to. And so an API request is a side effect, because we have to go outside of this function and interact with the big wide world. And what we can think of here is use effect. The return value of our callback function is not really useful. I can't return data and then use that. So for this callback function to be useful, it is going to have to go out and interact with the big wide world. And that might just mean something directly out of its scope, like a variable. When we call set data, we're performing a side effect. We're modifying some variable that, is outside of the return value. We violated this principle of data in, data out by going out and changing something, that wasn't directly related to input and output. And we want to try to write most of our code side effect free. Like for example, photo card is functional. It takes in props, and if I give it the same props, it is always going to give me the same props back. And that's good, right? But at the end of the day, we get paid for side effects. We get paid for talking to servers. We get paid for showing things on the page. You know, side effects is what make us money. So we're going to have to write them. But it's helpful to write them in a way that we can easily identify where they are and kind of trap them so that it makes them easier to reason about. So here it's very clear. This is where my side effect happens. It happens in this appropriately named useEffect function. If I had included this inside of PhotoCard, now PhotoCard is unpredictable. I don't know exactly what PhotoCard is going to return to me, and so it can cloud my ability to reason about and test my project, because now PhotoCard's results can be different even though I give it the same input. And so that's what we mean by a side effect. We mean by going out and interacting with the world outside of returning some modification of our input values. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, any more questions with this?
I had a question about how in the console, how it shows object from photo card first. I was wondering if there was a way to just make the data appear first before it ever runs anything, or do not want to do that because it would take too long to display anything.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So we're console logging inside of here, we're console logging our props. And we can see the first time our component renders, the props are all going to be undefined. And that's because the first time we render app, useState is going to set the value of data to be this empty object. So when we go down and we use it here, these are all going to be undefined. So the first time we render our component, nothing is going to show up. Then, when our request finishes, we're going to go out and we're going to set that data. And so we're going to re-render the component. And this time, useState is going to make data equal to the object we got back from the request. So that's why now we see these updated props here that now contain values in them. These now contain values. So we can't really prevent this from running the first time. If we want some default data in here, I can add it as an argument to useState. Like if I want the title to say, you know, not loaded yet, I can add that right here. And now it's going to show up as not loaded yet until I get the response back from the server. What we can also do is use conditional rendering, which is a fancy way of just doing JavaScript to check and see if our thing exists before we render our component. So I can do that with the AND operator, because we have to write an expression in here. And so we can't really use if statements, because if statements are not expressions. So what I can do is I can, for example, check to see if my data is defined. So this is one way of getting around this issue of making the initial value be an empty object, keeping it of the same data type. I could make it null or undefined. And what I could do is I could check before I run PhotoCard, before I try to get stuff out of here, I can check and see if data is defined. And I can do that with this somewhat cryptic piece of code. Data and PhotoCard. Because what the logical AND operator does is it says, if both things on both sides of me are true, then I return true. That's like what the logical AND means. They have to both be true. the way it works in JavaScript is it will return the rightmost value if they're both true. So if data is a truthy value, and this is a truthy value, which it is because it's stuff, false, null, undefined, 0, those are all falsy values. So what this does is it's going to check if data exists first. So if data is null, false, undefined, or 0, and is going to say, oh, that one's false. I don't even need to check the right side because I already know one of my two things is false, and if one of them is false, then the whole thing counts as false when we're doing ands. So we never run the right half of our code. This is a way to do that. We can also think of this in terms of the ternary operator. So the ternary operator is like our if statement. So if the thing before the question mark is true, then we do whatever is after the question mark. That's our true branch. The problem with the ternary operator is I also need to include this colon, and after that contains the else branch. If I don't have an else branch, then what I can do is just replace this question mark with and. It's like a true only ternary. But something I might want to do is have an else branch be something like a div that says loading. And so now I get a little loading screen while I'm fetching data from the server. And we could put any component we wanted in here. And this is one of the ways we get, fancy spinning, loading things while we're waiting for our data back from the server. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. All right, any other questions with this?
So like as of right now, is MVP met, or do we still have to display like more images and like?
So right now MVP is met. I can add more data if I wanted to. Like for example, I got a request earlier to use the date. So if I look inside of the object that I'm getting from my server, I have more data in here. Like here's a date.
Right.
So I'm just gonna add a date prop to my photo card and give it data.date, right? That's the key. And then I can, inside of here, just add, maybe I'll just do a div for now and give it props.date.
Okay, so it's really that simple. Awesome.
Yep. And
very cool.
If there are no more immediate questions on this, I also have a solution for the people that are banned. Which is, I, this morning, set up a mock API because I had a bunch of questions about multiple pictures. And so what I did is I set up just a little Heroku app that gives us back, instead of a single object, it gives us back 4 of these picture objects. And what we can do is we can very easily adapt what we've written to use this API instead, because PhotoCard is reusable. Joshua is saying, could you have it searchable by the date with a date picker? Yes, that would be a great use case for useEffect, where you have some way to set the value of like a date variable, and then we could make useEffect depend on that date. And then I could use this inside of here. I could use this, in a template string. And so I could use my date variable. And so now, if we have something on our page that allows us to change the date, useEffect is going to rerun. And now it's going to go out and it's going to fetch the photo associated with that new date. And so useEffect gives us a very powerful and simple way of controlling when this request runs. But I want to use this array of data because I think it's very important to me that we see a little bit more practice with maps, because that can be a confusing part of React, and so I want to make sure we have that down. How hard is it to implement a date picker? Well, if you wanted to implement it from scratch, probably kind of hard because dates are weird. You know, you have to take into account like leap years and finding all these things, and there are algorithms that will do that for you. But what is probably very easy to do is find a library for React that is a date picker. Yeah, Isaiah just linked one in the channel. And you can use that, and then you're set up and ready to go. A great part of writing these reusable components is it's very easy to publish them as standalone libraries. And so you can just download them, add them to your project, and drop them right in, like any other component. So, great. So now I want to switch over to this this API. So I'm going to copy and paste what I have right now, and I'm going to change it real fast. And I want to leave this in here because I'm going to flip back to this before I commit it. And so I'm going to change the URL that this is pointing to be my API instead. And I'm going to change this data to instead be photos. I'm going to call this set photos. And I'm going to make this be an array by default because I like keeping those data types the same. And so I'm going to get the data back from the server, which is still going to be at res.data. And then I'm going to use set photos. So now what's going to happen is when I render my component, I'm going to go and I'm going to get a network error. Oops, I forgot to enable cores on that. I'll get that updated real fast so you all can use it. Let me go edit that project. Doc Lambda walkthroughs. This. Let me. This is a little preview into the backend world. What's up, Amir?
Did you build it using the Express?
I did, yeah. Here it is. It's just a very basic server. Const cores, require cores, server.use, cores. Great. So then I will commit this on up to GitHub and push that. And now Heroku's automatically going to rebuild that deployed server. But I don't want to wait until then. So I'm just going to run this locally real fast. And now my server is running on localhost 4040. And I'm still getting a network error. Why is that?
Don't you need to do the HTTP and the localhost?
Oh, nope, I don't. It's the endpoint is at /API. What? It might get mad at me because I don't have HTTP in there. That could be it. Let's see. HTTP. Hey, there we go. So, sorry about that. Live demos can be not always incredibly smooth. So now I'm getting back an array of data from my API. And this is a whole bunch of these objects that we've been using to make our photo cards. And so this is all it takes in order to make a bunch of them. And this is why writing these reusable components is so powerful. Because I can get all of them from this array using map. And map I can then use to produce an array full of components. And React will take that array full of components and render them all to my page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a map right here. And I'm going to do photos.map. And I'm going to get one of those objects. I'm going to call it data just so I can reuse everything I've written down here. And I'm going to have this return a photo component. I'm going to copy this. Oop, I just want this. Recomment that out. Get rid of that. And so now what I'm doing inside of this map is I'm taking in one of the individual objects for one of the photos, and I'm producing a photo card component with it. And so now, if I save this, suddenly I've gone from having one photo to having a whole bunch of these cards being rendered because of how reusable I made this component. It doesn't care about my data source. So I've been able to separate the logic of getting the data from the server with the logic of presenting that data on my page. So it's very easy to swap out where I'm getting my data from, how it's structured. I just have to make sure I give it to my photo card component in the exact same way. So questions about this? Alright, do we feel good about this map here?
Did you store the photos into the state variable?
Yeah, I changed my state variable, so now it's called photos. And I'm setting it equal to the data I'm getting back from the server, which this time is an array full of objects. And notice I was very careful to make the initial value of photos be an array, because even though this array is empty, it has map defined on it. So the first time the component renders, photos is going to be an empty array. And when we get here, we're going to try to map over an empty array, which does nothing. It's just going to give us back an empty array. So we don't get an error here is what's important. If I removed this, that means the first time we render this component, photos is going to be undefined. And when we try to run undefined.map, essentially, we're going to get an error. Type error. Photos is undefined. We could use the same solution earlier with the and or the ternary. I could check and see if photos is defined before I do this. And sometimes this is the right solution. Other times it might be better to set that default data to be appropriate to our situation. You know, sometimes we might want to make use of this to use our ternary operator to display a loading thing. Sometimes we might want to put that loading thing inside of the photo card component itself. React is very hands-off on how we make some of these decisions, and so we're going to have to adapt to what feels right in this situation. How do I want this to work? And you know, we have all of our tools from JavaScript to decide how to do that. So that's why we can't forget, you know, some of the more interesting bits of JavaScript, like the ternary operator, the logical AND operator, you know, mapping over arrays, trying to map over things that aren't arrays. All of these things are very relevant. Alright, any other questions with this? I've gone slightly over lunch, and I don't want to take up your project time for today, so.
I got a quick question.
Yeah.
So if our API, you know, request is exceeded or whatever, are we like forever banned, or can we like show up tomorrow?
No, you should be able to show up later. You just can only make a certain number of requests in a given period of time. I don't remember what it is for the NASA API, but eventually they'll allow you to start making requests again.
Okay.
If you haven't already, if you go to request the access key, they approve it instantly.
Yeah. And you can
So
always
you can get one.
always just get another one.
What do you mean by that? Wait, because I signed up for a key, so.
I mean, if you really want to, and this time make sure we're doing this request inside of useEffect so that we don't make too many requests.
Right.
What we can do is if we go to the NASA API documentation, which has a bunch of cool things about what we can do to the API, like how we can get, you know, different dates, and we can decide not to get the HD link to the image. they have the ability to sign up for a developer key, and if you need a new one, you can just give it a different email this time. I'll also share, now that I'm done with this demo, I signed up with one of my burner email accounts, you know, that I use for like, you know, signing up to like the Macy's, you know, whatever. And so I'll drop that in chat, and if any of you want to use that for now, go for it. And also, as Isaiah said, the rate limiting is for an hour, so if you wait an hour, you should be able to make requests on your API key again.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Real quick, Henry, can you show everybody how to incorporate the API when you are making the request?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Amir. This is absolutely something I wanted to touch on. So first, I want to get my code back to for arrays. I want to get my code back to pulling from the NASA API instead of my homegrown one, because I think that that is valuable. And then I want to talk about how we interact with this API. So excuse the housekeeping real fast while I get this back up. Why is this getting mad at me? Oh, it's because I don't have the top of my use effect. Oh no, there it is. Just forgot to uncomment it. Okay, so now if I go back to my React app, yeah, we're just getting that one date from NASA. So the way we often give data to our APIs is if we look at this this string, which, let me try and make it a bit more legible. It's kind of running off the page here. Here, I can do that. So if we look at this string, it's a normal URL, but then we get to this question mark here. And after this are what we call query params, or query parameters. And this allows us to specify these key value pairs. See, these look kind of like props. We use the, you know, key and value pairs all over the place when we're coding. So we can essentially give the server variables that we want it to use. So we give it our API key, and so we set our API key equal to whatever value. If we want to add more query parameters, we separate them with an ampersand, which is what I do right here. So then I say ampersand, and I set the date equal to the date of the photo I want to retrieve. And that's defined in the API docs. API docs are our friend. Good API docs should be cherished, and you should be very thankful to the people developing and maintaining that API. And so it tells us we can add this parameter, one of our query parameters of date, and we can set its value in the format of year, 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 dash month, month, dash day, day. So if I wanted to get this from my birthday this year, this is my birthday. This is important information. We can see what the photo on my birthday was, and I think it might be a YouTube video. It is. So we broke our component. But it looks like it was about methane on Mars, which is pretty cool. I'll accept that as my birthday present from NASA. Yeah, so that's how we customize the kind of stuff we're getting back from our API. Yes, I do, Lisa, thank you for noticing. I do have an Earth Day birthday. So, okay. Thank you, Amir. It is so hard to make jokes on Zoom because everyone's muted. So I just have to assume what I said was very funny, which luckily I do all the time already. So, all right. Do we have any last questions with this? I'll make sure to push this code up to GitHub, so you can all take a look, and then also post this YouTube video later. Nice, Faye. Congratulations on having the correct birthday.
Could you scroll down to show where it says the ternary operator?
Yes.
Because I'm trying to get mine to work. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. So our ternary operator checks to see what the first thing is, if it's true or false, a truthy or falsy value. Then we do a question mark. That is, in fact, the ternary operator, this question mark. And then we specify what we want to happen, if it was true. Otherwise, we do what is false. You might be running into a bug. I'm going to jump back up real fast. Actually, I will just... No, that's not going to work. Okay, I'm going to jump back up real fast. You might be having a bug.
I was trying to do it with .map to try to get multiple.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you do the same thing, except in your true branch, you would just include the code for the map. And you wouldn't put that inside of curly braces. That's a potential issue because we're already in a set of curly braces. We're already writing JavaScript. We're not inside of JSX. Of course, when we drop back into JSX here, I do need to open up curly braces to do more JavaScript. But a potential issue as well is that this is going to depend on what we set our default state to be. So if I set this equal to an empty object is truthy. It's going to count as a true value. So this ternary is always going to do the true branch. And we could do some more things, like we could check the number of keys in this object, you know, to see if it's empty or not. But here, or with the map example where I was setting it equal to the empty array initially, we might want to change that to null, undefined, or false, so that when the ternary checks, it sees that it doesn't exist yet, and then it gives us our loading component instead. Does that help? Let me show this back on the screen.
Yeah, I was just trying to get it to how you showed before, where it was just showing multiple photos and it was changing
Oh, okay.
the data.
Yeah.
When you were using .map.
Yeah, and so that was, you also have to get the data from the Henry API, which let's check and see if that's back up.
So how would you do it with the NASA API
So
to show multiple?
the NASA API doesn't have the ability to give us back multiple images, which is why I made my bootleg API, because I wanted to give us the ability to practice with an API that gives us back an array instead of a single object. But when we look at these documentations, we see all we ever get back is a single object. Right? There's no way for me to specify I actually want multiple pictures, and that's just how they wrote their API. I wrote mine to give us back this array. Let me check and see if it works now. Okay. Why is that getting mad at me? Oh, it's because I did this up here. Alright. So let's check and see if Heroku rebuilt. Yes. Okay, so now this API is back up. The Henry mock API is working. So if you want to get that array back, I dropped a link to that in channel. And that'll give you an array back of images that you can map over.
Thanks. And then could you scroll to the bottom one more time,
Yep.
please?
Of course.
Thanks.
And I'll push this up to GitHub just in a minute. So if anyone wants to reference this code later, you can. All right. Any final questions? This will be the final one.
I have a question about the use effect.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have put in console log statements inside of that callback function so that you can check the data that's coming in, and that is appearing multiple times with reference to the same line,
Mm-hmm.
like I'm having a funny situation, even though I included a second parameter for the use effect
Yeah.
hook, that is the date. It refers to the date selector, and that's working, but for some reason, it's like the call is being made 3 times. I'm getting those console log requests 3 times with reference to the same line each
Okay.
time.
And
Why
so
that might happen?
yeah, so when we provide data to this arguments, or not the arguments, the dependencies array, whenever that changes, we're going to run this useEffect function. If we only want this to run once, then we put nothing in here. But if we want it to go out and fetch the data associated with our changing date, then it's going to run whenever that variable changes, which most likely it's going to run once the first time we render the function, because date is going to be undefined, or whatever our default value is, and that's new because it's getting it for the first time. So it's going to run once. Then you're probably changing the date somehow. So that's going to re-render our function. useEffect is going to see the date inside of this array has changed, and so then it's going to run again. As far as it running a third time, you might be setting the date again somehow, and that's causing it to run a third time. But if you, inside of your console log date, you'll see that each time it runs, it should be a different value.
It's actually, I'm clearing the console each time to double check it, and every time that I clear it and then pick a new date, it runs that date request 3 times.
It runs that date request 3 times.
Yeah, I'm perplexed.
Interesting.
Sorry, this is a specific question, so I was just curious if you knew offhand why it would be happening. But
good. I would probably have to take a look at the code, so feel free to send me that in a DM.
Okay.
But what could that be? I mean, possibly you might be calling setDate within the useEffect function, and that's causing it to run multiple times. Yeah, I'd have to take a look at the code. I wouldn't know offhand what that might be, but
okay,
we should be able to figure that out.
I'll send it to you. Thanks.
All right, great. Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time that you've so graciously given to me. And so good luck on your afternoon projects. I'm very excited to see the beautiful things that everyone builds. And for the people that lack great artistic talent like myself, I'm excited to see with what you're able to come up with anyway. So have a good afternoon, everyone.